Hello and welcome to another episode of the Everyday Joy podcast. I'm your host, Joy Ravella. Let's get into today's verse.
Learn to do good, to be fair, and to help the poor, the fatherless, and widows. Isaiah 1:17 from the Living Bible.
Well, on this Friday, wrapping up a week of amazing conversations with you, Sharon, I'm so excited for today's episode.
We've had a week, haven't we? We've talked about so many things.
We've covered how to continue to trust God when there are things in your life you can't control, how exactly to do that process, the fruit of forgiving others, how you can overcome evil with good. We've had so many great chats. And today it's interesting because as we head towards a weekend, we're talking about learning to do good, to be fair, to help the poor, the fatherless, and the widows. Isaiah 1:17. And if I'm honest with you, as I head towards the end of the week, the last thing I'm thinking about is lovely charitable things like this. I wish I did, if I'm being completely honest. But my first impression of this verse is like, that's not going to happen unless I make it a priority.
Yeah,
I think that's my first thought about this verse. Like all of those things don't naturally come to me. I have to make time for them. What about you? What are your thoughts about this verse?
Yes, we do have to make time for them. And I think, though, that God gives us opportunities to make time for them. When He knows we have a willing heart, He'll take it and run with it. So I think He'll give us those opportunities. But yeah, this verse is all about doing, isn't it? It's very forceful in the Hebrew. It's got lots of action words in the Hebrew, doing the right thing by God. So we need to learn to do God good. We need to demand justice. We need to set the oppressed right. We need to bring justice to the orphan, protect the fatherless and the widow. We need to do all those things. And why? Because God values those things. So He will give us, because He values those things, He will give us the tools, He'll give us the energy, He'll give us the passion. That's His heart. And He will share that with us and empower us to do those good things.
Speaking of His heart, what does this verse tell you about who God is? You answered that a little bit. But what do you specifically think this verse tells you about what matters to God?
Yeah, well, it tells me that, like in everything we've talked about, all the verses we've talked about this week, God doesn't expect us to do what He isn't already doing. He walks ahead of us and He leads the way. And all He wants us to do is to follow Him and imitate Him as dearly loved children, I think it says somewhere. So in countless places in the Bible, God is also described as being righteous, as being a father to the fatherless, a protector of widows. He saves the afflicted of the earth. God has a heart for the vulnerable in our society. He values them, and He reminds us that we need to look out for those people. We shouldn't ignore them. We should go with God's heart and do the right thing by God. And that's at the heart of this verse.
I love that you mentioned that because God set the most beautiful examples for us, like we were talking about earlier on in the week, with how to rest, how to forgive, how to choose a good way. And again here, learning how to do good, God's also set up a way for us to do that. And you're so right, because earlier on you were saying that, God gives you opportunities. You don't necessarily need to go hunt them down and fill your life with trying to impress God, because it's not coming from a place of you need to do all of these things, otherwise I will not love you. It's being invited into the way God operates and the way He builds His kingdom, which is just such an easy thing, but it's also hard as well because it requires us to say yes sometimes. Do you have a personal story around where this applies to you?
Yes, I do. It's a bit of a lightweight story. But it's humbling.
I like those ones.
So when my kids were teenagers, they used to leave their stuff everywhere. It used to drive me crazy. They used to leave the bags in the hallway and the clothes all over the laundry when I used to go. I used to nag them and go, pick up your clothes and pick up your school bag. And I didn't like being that kind of person. But I also realized that my kids were doing what I was doing because I was leaving all my stuff all over the house as well. I was just as guilty as they were. And that came to me. I realized, and I sort of cringed about it a lot. And I realized my kids weren't going to just do what I say. They were going to do what I do. So I had to lead by example. So I had to look after my own stuff put it in its right place, then I could ask them and expect them to follow through. And that's what God is like. He goes ahead of us, He does the hard yards, and He expects us to follow through, and He encourages us to.
I love that. Again, it's going back to the fact that we don't have to reinvent the wheel, which is really good. I love your example as well, because as you were describing that story, I was remembering something my dad often says about me. He used to call me tufan, which is the Hindi word for storm.
Oh, wow.
Because I'd come home from school and within a span of like 10 seconds, shoes on one side of the hallway, bag thrown across the sofa, my books everywhere. I used to hate having my hair tied up. I used to like rip my hair ties out and you'd find the bobby pins like all over the floor and everything. Oh, my poor parents. I don't know if much has changed. I'm still a little bit like that, but you're so right. It's like, what is it? What's that saying? It's monkey see, monkey do.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's right. And look, I realized that I was the little storm in our house as well. And I expected my kids to be so neat and tidy, but I wasn't being neat and tidy. So I needed them to follow what I was doing, and I needed to make sure I was doing the right things. So, yeah.
So this is a little extra for experts question here. This verse, I'll read it out again. Learn to do good, to be fair, to help the poor, the fatherless, and the widows. Have you ever received help, been on the receiving end of someone who has done good, and you've really seen God through what they have done?
Yeah, look, I've probably had not really dramatic examples, but there have been times in my life when I've been ill and I've been unable to cook or clean. I've had a very difficult pregnancy with one of my kids, and I had to lie in bed for about 8 months. And at that time, I relied very heavily on my Christian community around me, and they organized a meals roster and a vacuuming roster. And I had 2 other kids, 2 other toddlers in the house at that stage. And this was with my third. So it was a really, really difficult time. And I was so grateful that they banded together and they just saw me through such a difficult time in my life. I mean, my family also stepped in, and of course my husband as well, but he was working, and all the other mums in my Christian community they really, really helped me. They were Jesus' arms and legs for me at that time, and I'll never forget it.
Well, that wraps up today's episode of the Everyday Joy podcast. You can get in touch via the email. It's just in the description below. I look forward to Monday's episode. Catch up with you then.